The Carter-Baker Commission looked at voter fraud in voting in 2008. They found that there's no evidence of extensive fraud in U.S. elections or multiple voting, but both occur and it could affect the outcome of close elections and many other findings. The absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. That's what the Carter-Baker Commission said, not me. The Carter-Baker report said, recommend to reduce fraud, recommend prohibiting third-party organization candidates and political party activists from handling absentee ballots. I think that's related to ballot harvesting. So my question for Ms. Abrams, do you support voter identification laws?
Yes.
Okay. Do you support?
There are 35 states in the United States that have had voter identification laws.
Okay.
In fact, every state requires some form of identification.
Right. Okay.
What I've objected to is restrictive voter identification laws
So,
that narrow the set of permissible
right.
materials that allow for
The answer is yes as a concept. Do you support the idea that voting should be limited to American citizens?
Yes.
Do you support that we should have, do you support ballot harvesting? Are you familiar with that term?
I'm familiar with the term of art that's been propagated to describe a variety of efforts. But for example, on Native American reservations where they are precluded from access due to underfunding to reach in a timely fashion locations for voting, I do believe that it's appropriate for tribal elders to collect the ballots and retrieve them and use a single source of delivery to provide those ballots and thus provide Native Americans with the opportunity to participate in elections.
Do you support it beyond Native American voting?
As I've said, I believe that it depends on the situation and that the term of art that is being used describes a variety of behaviors, and each of those behaviors should be examined for utility and for veracity, and to the extent that they help voters participate in elections in a lawful manner, they should be permitted.
Okay. Do you believe the Republican majority in Georgia, House, Senate, when they are making the changes to your state voting laws, do you think they're motivated by trying to suppress the African-American vote?
I have seen it happen sometimes that they are. I've seen other bills that have been truly bipartisan in nature that have looked at and fully examined.
But you believe that's the motivation behind, do you believe that's the motivation behind these laws?
I believe the motivation behind certain provisions in SB 202 are a direct result to the increased participation of communities of color in the 2020 and 2021 elections. I have participated for 11 years. As the Speaker Pro Tem Jones pointed out, we served together, and almost every year there was a voting law. And when those voting laws were neutral, not only on their face,
well, I'm out of time. Do you think the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pro Tem, the lady, Jan Jones, is motivated by trying to limit the African-American voters in Georgia? Do you think that's...
I believe there is racial animus that generated those bills. I would not assume that that racial animus is shared by every person. But if the result is that racial animus exists and it eliminates access to the right to vote, then regardless of a certain person's heart, if the effect is deleterious to the ability of people of color to participate in elections, then that is problematic and that is wrong and it should be rejected by all.
So I'm not exactly sure that Lindsey Graham knew who he was speaking to when he began throwing out the usual Republican talking points against voting rights in this country, but I think it's safe to say that Stacey Abrams didn't exactly give him the answers that he was looking for. Now, of course, Graham tries to throw out terms like ballot harvesting, which at this point is just a scary moniker for ballot collection. That's all it is. It means that someone's allowed to collect and drop off the ballot of someone else. It's useful for people who aren't mobile, who are elderly, who live far away from a voting center, who might not be able to vote because of work. Whatever the reason, it isn't some scary phenomenon, it's a useful one. Graham goes on to try and catch Abrams in questions like, do you support only Americans voting? Which everyone on the left agrees with. It is actually Republican fear-mongering that would have you think that the left is just shipping people in from Mexico and dropping them right off at polling places. And if that sounds ridiculous, consider the fact that Donald Trump and Fox News still, to this day, are suggesting that millions of undocumented immigrants vote in our elections to swing the results. Graham also asks Abrams if she supports voter ID, which again she agrees with. The issue with voter ID as far as Democrats are concerned isn't that we don't want people to be identified. It's that if IDs aren't free, then those who can't afford them are faced with a monetary barrier to voting. And so the solution is simple. Have states distribute free identification to its residents. It's an obvious step that then begs the question for states that don't supply identification, even though doing so will prevent people from exercising their rights to vote, why? The issue here isn't that Democrats are abusing a system to vote illegally, but that states are leveraging poverty to prevent certain factions of the electorate from voting at all. And finally, here's the last point I want to touch on. Graham invokes the Carter-Baker Commission, which is a 16-year-old commission led by Jimmy Carter and James Baker that issued its findings in a 2005 report. Bear in mind, YouTube had just been created in 2005. Facebook didn't even allow worldwide users to sign up at that point. Twitter hadn't yet been founded. The iPhone didn't exist yet. Pluto was still a planet, and cell phones look like this, just to give you an idea of how long ago 2005 was, especially when it comes to advances in digital security. But we hear about the Carter-Baker Commission a lot, so let's just take a look at the actual text of the commission's report, since Republicans love to invoke it so much. It says that Oregon moved entirely to a vote-by-mail system in 1998 and continues, quote, Oregon appears to have avoided significant fraud in its vote-by-mail elections by introducing safeguards to protect ballot integrity, including signature verification. In other words, the one state that did implement statewide vote-by-mail for general elections that use safeguards that are widely used today are safe. Mail ballots today do require signature verification, often for both the application and the ballot itself, thereby reaffirming the findings in this report. The commission report goes on to cite an issue with the 2004 gubernatorial election in Washington, saying, quote, when 2 and 3 ballots there were cast by mail, authorities lacked an effective system to track the number of ballots sent or returned. As a result, King County election officials were unable to account for all absentee ballots, which is fair for 2004, but since 2004, we obviously have technological advances to track every single ballot that comes from every single voter, meaning that this point is now moot. And of course, the line that conservatives all cling on to, which is, quote, vote by mail is, however, likely to increase the risks of fraud and of contested elections in other states. Not that it has increased fraud, just that it increases the risk that it could. In other words, this whole smoking gun is about the potential for fraud. And that's significant because it follows the same logic as every other Republican argument. Not that there is any fraud, just that there could be widespread fraud. In other words, they are introducing solutions for problems that do not exist. And finally, the recommendation from the report itself on vote by mail says, quote, the commission encourages further research on the pros and cons of vote by mail and of early voting. Even with all of the caveats to vote by mail that were introduced, still the report doesn't even dissuade from using that method. It simply says that further research is required. And in the decade and a half since this report's been published, that further research is exactly what we got. And still the research has proven that there is no evidence of widespread fraud when it comes to vote by mail. The point is that Republicans will parrot every bad faith talking point that sounds good on the surface, but doesn't actually mean anything. Why parrot a 15-year-old report as evidence of the dangers of mail ballots when the examples invoked in that report aren't even valid anymore? Is the point for these Republicans to actually find voter fraud, or just give lazy examples intended to fearmonger about voter fraud? You don't have to look further than Lindsey Graham's questioning to get an answer to exactly that. To see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, where I discuss the week's top stories and interview major players in the world of politics, like Vice President Kamala Harris, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer, Katie Porter, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, and many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.